Am I audible?
Yes, sir, you're perfect.
And my screen is visible, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So I'm going to introduce this bioplausible neural computing and neuromorphic edge for about half an hour to 40 minutes. And then Shonok will take over with some practical use cases and how to program these things. There's an entire paradigm shift from whatever you have heard in the morning and so far. The conventions, the concepts, the programming, everything is different in this case. So it might be feel a little odd, but let's see how it goes. Okay. So you have already seen in the morning what industry wants in terms of edge computing. So if I can just share a video, this is a challenge video from MBZIRC challenge that was held in Dubai last year. So can you see the video?
Sir, right, we can see the presentation.
Okay, so probably this screen doesn't go on. Anyway, so I'll just tell you about the challenges or the things that you heard in the morning. So the requirement is that in case of edge, if you want to bring AI to the edge, so in most cases, the real practical applications involves robots, unmanned aerial vehicles or drones, or AGVs, autonomous guided vehicles, or small vehicles that work in warehouses. So in these cases, the idea is to bring the AI, the intelligence, directly inside the edge, so that the inferencing can happen on the edge itself without resorting to the cloud, thereby reducing the latency and performing the inference in real time. So there are many other use cases. For example, personal assistants in Japan, where robots are supposed to aid elderly people and assist them in their day-to-day lives. There is a real requirement of these things because Japan is supposedly they do not have enough nurses to take care of the elderly people. Then you have heard about the driverless cars, industrial robots. In all these cases, the goal is to bring the AI directly inside the devices or the edge. Now, this search for these entire intelligent applications, or should I say the artificial intelligence, the holy grail, has been going on for quite some time, starting from 1954, when the first neural networks were created. So that was the first successful simulation of neurons in 1954. ELIZA was developed in 1966. Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. Your presentation is not updating here, I think. Screens are not updating.
What can you see now?
The first slide is, maybe others can confirm.
Yeah, Arijit, you have to go full screen first.
Yeah, now it is in the third screen.
But still it is not in full screen mode.
I am in full screen. Let me just...
I think you're sharing maybe not the screen.
Okay. Can you see
Yeah.
Okay.
This is happening.
Sorry for the interruption. So 1972, the first AI robot was created. 1997, you might remember that Kasparov was beaten by the IBM supercomputer Deep Blue. 2011, Watson, the IBM computer again won the Jeopardy quiz show. And in 2017, the Google AlphaGo system defeated the reigning human champion. So all these have been the curtain raisers in the journey of AI. I'll just take an example of this deep QA in case of IBM Watson. So the idea was the Jeopardy quiz show is a long-running quiz show that happened in the US. It has been running for over 25 years. Now, they'll give you 1 or 2 or 3 clues from which you have to formulate the question from the clue itself. Now, for example, say you have been given a clue that of the 4 countries in the world that the United States does not have diplomatic relations with, the one that's farthest north. So you have to formulate a question from this clue. What IBM did was they analyzed these type of typical quiz questions, and they formulated something called lexical answer type, or LAT. Now, within this LAT, within this particular clue, the thing that you want to find, or the type of the answer that you are supposed to give, is the LAT. So you are trying to find a country, right? So LAT is countries, and the keyword is the one. So you have to find one country that is your answer, or the LAT. So from this clue, IBM does some processing, some text processing, and finds out by searching the internet, searching other knowledge bases, it finds out that the 4 countries in the world that the United States does not have a diplomatic relation with are Bhutan, Cuba, Iran, and South Korea. And the final answer is, from the second part of this clue, is that out of these 4, you are supposed to find the one that is farthest north. So that is how the text processing goes. It breaks the clue into multiple parts or subparts, and from each of them, they try to find the keywords and lexical answer types. And from there, they ultimately arrive at the answer, which in this case is North Korea. So there is a whole amount of processing that went on in the background, which you never come to know about. Whereas in case of humans, when I ask you the same question, you can do it almost without resort. I mean, the similar kind of background processing happens, but you are not even aware of it, what happens, and you can simply answer that the answer to this is North Korea. So the question that we often often face is whether these systems are really intelligent or not. So there's a story about a Chinese room argument, a theory presented by John Rogers Searle from UC Berkeley back in 1984. The idea was, say if you have a room that is closed from all sides. There are no windows, no doors, just a letter hole is there on the side of the room. And there's a person, a normal person like you or me, sitting inside the room. We don't know a single word of Chinese, but we are equipped with a book that contains a huge set of Chinese symbols, from which we can tell that, okay, if this is my input Chinese symbol, then the output symbol is this. Or given a sequence of input symbols, I can look up from that book and say that these are my output symbols. Now people start coming in front of the room, and they write some Chinese symbols on pieces of papers, and they drop it through the letter hole. The person inside, his task is to see those input symbols, and from the lookup table, write the output symbols and return it back through the paper hole. Now initially the person will be shaky, so he has to look up a lot of things, and then he'll start becoming expert. And after some time, as soon as you drop the inputs from that letter hole, he will give you an output. And the people outside, they'll start to think that there is a native Chinese speaker sitting inside the room, which is not true. So the person inside, even if he's rightly answering rightly providing the answers against all those input Chinese symbols, he doesn't know a word of native Chinese. So the same paradigm can happen, can be used here as an example, that these systems, whatever we are talking about, they really do not apply the intelligence. They're not intelligent per se. What they are very good at recognizing patterns from huge amount of data. Now that gives rise to the first problem, that you have to skim through hundreds and thousands of megabytes of data, millions and millions of images, trying to find out the features of those images, the features from the speech, from videos, and then trying to identify a pattern from those input images and learning some things, basically building up your lookup table, so that whenever you get some kind of test data, images or speech, you would be able to identify the patterns inside and produce your inference. So this skimming through that huge data set, the large volume of data, that often becomes a bottleneck, and it consumes a huge amount of power. Just as an example, the IBM Watson machine that I talked about, that uses 2,880 PowerPC cores with 16 terabytes of RAM that cost around $3 million. And the technique that IBM uses is called Deep QA, that has been implemented on Hadoop, runs on SUSE Linux. And at full capacity, that IBM Watson machine consumes at around 85 kilowatts of energy, 85,000 watts of energy, which is almost equivalent to the amount of power you need to light up the entire block of Manhattan. So that is the bottleneck that we are facing nowadays in case of big data centers. Even if you consider the edge devices, say you have a camera equipped with a processor, a parking camera or a traffic camera equipped with a processor that consumes as little as 20 watts. Even the most energy efficient Jetson GPUs would consume about 20 watts or so. Now, in a parking lot, you may have hundreds of such cameras. Consider a city, there will be few hundred thousands of such cameras. And if you take the cumulative power consumptions, they become really, really huge. So can we do something so that this power consumptions, which has become a bottleneck now, can be reduced in some other way? Now, when we do these kind of things, identify objects, identify something from a speech, we consume just about 10 to 20 watts, right? Humans. So the thing is, can we borrow some learnings from the mammalian brains? Now, I'll just go through a very small 60-second brain primer, I call it. So why do we have brains? That's the first question that we need to answer. Plants do not have brains, but they lead a very stable life without any brain, without resorting to any equations solving or any perception inside the brains. There's a small animal called sea squirt that is hatched with a very elementary nervous system. It swims through the ocean, settles down on a rock few hundred yards away, and then simply digests its brain. But after that, it lives a healthy life. So from neuroscience perspective, sensory motor theories, it seems that an animal need a brain to move, to find food, and to find partners. So in short, a brain produces goal-directed behavior to maximize our probability of survival. So specifically, a brain enables a creature to react to a specific environmental situation. That is, we can adapt to the situations. It analyzes sensory representations of the environment so that we can take some actions corresponding to all these sensory perceptions. And then there is mapping them to motor actions. Now, let's take an example. Any of you, can you recognize this building?
Yes, sir. This is IEM's building.
Right. How long did it take you to recognize it?
A fraction of a second.
Right. Because you have seen this building for maybe few years or so, you can so easily recognize the building. So that's where human brains are good at. Once you identify something, once you learn something, it creates a certain something like a neural connection, a circuit inside your brain. Whenever you see the same object or something similar, there are millions and billions of neurons, but only that particular circuit will get activated. And as soon as that circuit gets activated, you know that this is the building that I'm supposed to recognize. In case of computers, however, remember that computers are much faster than brains. They operate in nanoseconds, whereas neurons operate in milliseconds. Still, human brains can recognize these objects or are good at perceiving something better than computers, because to identify this building as an IEM building, a computer will first have to identify that, okay, this is a building. Then it will have to search through millions and billions of images to find out which building is there. Whereas in case of human brains, this happens within only 10 to 100 processing steps between perception and action. Even taking 10 milliseconds per synaptic stage, just these few steps are really efficient to or really necessary. Only these few steps are necessary to find out the action corresponding to that perception. We do not know of any algorithm, even today, that can, any computer algorithm, I should say, even today, that can work within so few steps. So there lies the efficiency of human brains learning from less data and trying to find out an action corresponding to a perception within just 10 to 100 processing stages. Now, we call a brain an anticipatory memory system, so that you can anticipate ahead what is going to happen, and you go by whatever you have learned from your previous days. Like there's a concept that had another background concept that may have had another background concept. So you keep on adding these concepts in a cumulative way, and you try to arrive at a cause for a sensation and take necessary actions. For example, let's say you are walking on the street, and there's suddenly a pin that you step onto. You feel a sensation on your leg that there's a pin that you have stepped on. It creates some neuro activity in your nervous system, and after that you take several actions simultaneously. You balance yourself, you feel the pain, you lift your foot, everything happens together, right? Let's say you wake up in the morning, and suddenly while you were sleeping in your bed, I have lowered the floor of your room by 2 feet. You suddenly wake up, and when you try to step on the floor, you will obviously fall down, because you didn't know that I have lowered the floor by 2 feet, because you were anticipating your floor to be at a certain height from your bed, at a certain level from your bed. That didn't happen. So you'll fall down. That means you're learning whatever you have learned from the previous concepts. They stay with you, and your nervous system is inherently triggered or inherently related to those concepts. Now, these are the facets of biological intelligence, what mammalian brains are good at. It is good in visual comprehension, it is good in audio speech comprehension, navigation and route planning, taking decisions, modeling other minds, learning all these things from limited data. Whereas in case of computers, they are good in the computational ability is very fast, very efficient. The speed is much more than human brains. The memory access is much faster. The memory lifetime is greater. Capacity is greater. Accuracy is better. Whereas in case of mammalian brains, we go by the concepts of perception, adaptation, flexibility, cognition, these things. Now, that people have been researching on these brains and neurons for a long time. So what they found out was that our human brains really contain a kind of something like a GPS inside the brains, a built-in GPS. So even if you have seen a building, say 20 years ago, once you have seen that building, whatever happens after 20 years or so, if not major modifications have happened, you will still be able to recognize that building. Remember that example of that IEM building that I shown just a while ago. So you recognize that building because certain cells inside your brain created a circuit that got triggered when you saw that building. Similarly, all human brains have a built-in GPS. So if you can identify that IEM building even at night, even when it's raining, even when it's cloudy, it doesn't matter what the environment is, that circuit gets triggered. So you know the places by their surroundings. You can map yourself with respect to a city or a state with respect by using the surroundings. Now, this is an interesting experiment that happened that was done by this John O'Keefe back in about 20-30 years ago. So he inserted a probe inside the brain of a mouse, and that mouse was moving inside a large a black box that was blackened from inside, and its movement created a certain pattern. So certain cells inside the mouse's brain or the rat's brain were getting triggered when it visited the places that it had already visited. So when you go to a place that you already know, those circuits inside your brain, those particular cells inside your brain, they get activated. So this is the experiment that effectively proved that. So based on this, they created the concepts of grid cells and place cells, which together make the mapping inside brains very effective. So there are different cells like these place cells, grid cells, border cells, head direction cells. Each of them have a particular function. So place cells, they fire at external sensory landmarks. So whenever you see a landmark that you have previously seen, or you arrive at a certain landmark which you have previously visited, that particular cell inside your brain will get activated. Border cells kind of specifically fires when you are at the edge of something. You are sitting at the side of a room. You know that you are sitting at the side of a room because certain cells inside your brain detect that you are sitting at the edge or the border. Which way you are looking at, your head direction cells govern that. Speed cells kind of gets activated when you are moving at a certain speed. So based on these things, people created new ways of navigating between cities. So this is a video from Google DeepMind, who used this concept of grid cells and place cells along with the Google Street View data. Instead of learning learning how to navigate by normal ways that people use in like simultaneous localization and mapping, they tried to navigate through cities using landmarks, just like we do. When we are navigating through cities or places, we use certain landmarks that I am supposed to go to hometown, or from hometown I'm supposed to go to, say, EcoSpace. So I use landmarks while I'm navigating through the cities. So this is how Google DeepMind started to use this concept of grid and place cells and created a whole new concept of navigation using the Google Street View. Now, all these things, as I said, happen inside the brains with minimal energy consumption. And the question that we'll try to answer in this case is why does this happen in such a way inside the brains, and how does it happen? So that brought an entire paradigm shift in computing and AI, which we call neuromorphic computing, a totally different paradigm of computing. Now, the computers that you use today, be it them, the servers or the edges or your laptops, they are all governed by the concept given by von Neumann. So they are all the von Neumann machines, where you have a CPU, you have a memory, you bring the data out of the memory to the CPU, then you process the data, and the result goes back to the memory. And this creates a traffic between the CPU and the memory. And often when we are talking about these learning systems, where the data volume is huge, this traffic creates a bottleneck on that data bus, thereby leading, that is one of the biggest reasons why the energy consumption in these systems is high. Whereas in case of neuromorphic computers, it's a completely different non-von Neumann computing system people have designed, where the CPU itself, the processor itself, is architected as a connection of millions and millions of neurons and synapses. So neurons are the entities which process a signal, and synapses are the entities where the result or the intermediate results are stored. So a neuromorphic computer is typically a machine that comprises of many memory neurons and synapses, and they communicate using simple messages, which are just electrical signals or spikes, like whatever happens inside our brains. Our brains process spikes that are sensed by our sensory systems, like eye, like ears or skin. They receive a sensation, a perception, and that converts into an electrical signal or spike, which is a most simple possible temporal message, and it facilitates the algorithm inspired by these biological systems. So there are several different versions of neuromorphic platforms. IBM created one called True North. Spinnaker is a huge neuromorphic machine created by the Human Brain Project from University of Manchester. It's actually a neuromorphic supercomputer, you can say. BrainScale-S is another form of neuromorphic machine, again part of the Human Brain Project. It's from University of Heidelberg. Intel Loihi is a chip that Intel is working on as a research prototype that is that is kind of poised to come out maybe within a couple of years or so. And it's touted as the next generation of edge devices, one of the tiny edge devices that we actually concentrate on. There are some other machines like Spikey from Heidelberg, Neurogrid from Stanford, Zeroth is a chip from Qualcomm. So all these things, these platforms, they comprise of the entire ecosystem of neuromorphic devices on which people are trying to create new types of algorithms, new types of architectures, new types of learning systems, which will be capable of using the biggest single benefit of these systems, that is consumption of very low amount of energy. So that is the single biggest benefit of these systems. There is another possible benefit, that all these systems tend to learn from very low volume of data. The way that we talked about what happens in case of our brains, we learn from very less data. Similarly, these systems tend to learn from very less data. This is how Intel views its neuromorphic, the evolving neuromorphic applications. So we have our conventional machine learning systems, the standard ML algorithms that you learn in case of AI or ML courses. Then there is this brain-inspired computation, other genetic algorithms and all sorts of different things. And there's this newer generation of computer architectures, for example, this neuromorphic architecture. They converged in one area where this little part is the area which is covered by the deep learning systems. And then there is a spiking neural network, a problem set that can be solved using spiking neural networks. The main pillar of this neuromorphic application paradigm is these spiking neural networks, often called as the next generation of neural networks. Now, even in the space of spiking neural networks, we have different types of problems that people are trying to solve. Mostly people concentrate on these ideas that are guided by neuroscience, olfaction inspired rapid learning, neural field SLAM, the robotic SLAM, or the simultaneous localization and mapping. That is how the robots try to map themselves in a certain space. Evolutionary search, cortical models. This is where the computational neuroscientists are looking at. At the same time, the same architecture can be used for optimization problems, parallel graph search, vector symbolic architecture, semantic point architectures, which are applicable to many different types of problems that appear in the field of engineering, or in our case in AI. So just to give you a background or a starting point from where Shonok can start the details about neuromorphic computing, these are the features of SNN. So there are many different neuronal models available that can be used in these cases. It's not the perceptron model that you use in case of deep learning and standard neural networks. These neural models are based on biological neurons like Hodgkin-Huxley, Leaky integrated fire, Izhikevich. All these have been designed based on what really happens inside biological neurons. SNNs are perceived to be less energy consuming because the spikes on which the system operates, for example, this image that you are seeing, the GIF, where a person is moving his hand in front of a camera called a dynamic vision sensor. It's a new type of camera that is being used in these cases. What essentially it does is, it captures only the changes between each frame. So if you remain completely still in front of the camera, nothing will be seen in the output. The camera won't do anything. It won't capture anything. Whenever there is a change in the luminosity, those events are captured by the camera. And those are the events that trigger the spikes in the case of SNN, exactly similar to how human vision is triggered. So human vision necessarily captures these changes in luminosity, changes in motion, that triggers your visual system. From there, you learn to identify things. So exactly in the same way that dynamic vision sensors operate, and that is used in case of SNNs to identify things, identify objects. So essentially, as you can see, because it's not capturing the entire frame, and just capturing the changes, the amount of data inherently is much less than a normal camera. And that is where one of the reasons of efficiency lies, because the data volume itself inherently is less. The spikes are sparse in time. In the temporal dimension, there will be only a finite set of spikes. Now, using these few spikes, but each of these spikes have very high information content, but in turn, the sparsity of the spikes is the main reason why the energy consumption in case of neuromorphic systems is much less, and they tend to converge faster and number of operations are less. Remember the example of recognizing the building that I shown before. So you learn to recognize the building from a very limited amount of data. You may have seen the building few times, and that is sufficient for you to recognize the building. It converges very fast because when you see a building or when you see any landmark, you kind of try to approximate it with something that you have seen. So the number of operations is less, and it arrives at the result much faster than the conventional computing system, because as I said, it happens only within 10 to 100 synaptic stages or 10 to 100 processing steps. They also use much less training data. As you can see, obviously see that the data itself is sparse, so the training data volume is less, which is why online learning becomes easier and they work much better in real-time scenarios. And these are the kind of main reasons or features that we use in case of SNNs. So that kind of sets the background of this whole system of neuromorphic computing, what SNN is, why we tend to use the neuromorphic systems. From here on, Shaunak will take you through the details of how SNNs operate and how and why we get the advantages that we claim in these cases, and why they become why they're important in the case of edge computing that we are trying to talk about. So that's where I'll end. From here on, it's over to Shaunak. You can ask any questions if you have on this part. You can ask them now, or you can wait for the whole talk to be completed for your questions.
So participants, if you really want to ask any question right now, you may go ahead. You can unmute yourself and ask directly to sir, or you may, question or have the query later after the second round of session. You can also write your query in the chat box. So, sir, since there is no question coming up
I think
immediately,
Shaunak should start. Shaunak, you can share your screen. I'll stop.
Okay. Thank you, sir, for it. It was a very informative. You opened a new horizon for us, a new different domain to us. Thank you for the informative talk. So now we have Mr. Shaunak Dey, our next speaker. Mr. Dey has done his NCA from BITS, Misra in 2002. He has completed his bachelor's from Calcutta University. Presently, he is working as a senior scientist at TCS Research. His research area is in the area of brain-inspired neuromorphic computing, spiking neural network, computational neurosciences. Till date, he has several international publications and multiple granted patents to his credit. He is also involved in bodies like IEEE, ACM, India, to name a few. So I wholeheartedly welcome you, sir, to this event. Now is an opportune moment. I would request sir to address the gathering. Over to you, sir.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for such a nice introduction, and good afternoon to everyone. Is my screen visible and am I audible?
Yes, you are perfectly audible and the screen is also visible.
Okay, fine. So, so far as Arijit has spoke about, set the background for spiking neural network and neuromorphic computing. So you, by the way, by this time you already know the main benefits of spiking neural network is that, or the neuromorphic computing paradigm is that they consume much less power compared to their existing competitors like DNN or CNN kind of architectures, because they are more bioplausible and because they are really inspired, or I would say more close to how our brain works. So to understand why it is so, I mean, to understand how it is so beneficial in terms of energy and how it can learn so fast, how it can adapt so fast. So I think it would be better if we can start with how our brain works. So maybe in our brain, if you see, this is the first picture that you can see. This is the first picture drawn by Ramon Cajal, who is a Spanish scientist who got Nobel along with Golgi in 1906. This is the first drawing of brain neurons. So from that era, around last part of 18th century, neuroscientists have started inquiring inside brain and started knowing how brain works and started inquiring how it functions and how they are connected, all those things. But one thing they have found out is that the basic unit of our brain, or I would say the nervous system, is a neuron. And the central picture, as it is showing, if you can see my mouse, this is how a neuron looks like. So it has a dendrite, which captures information from others. It has a soma that is actually the computational unit, and it has an axon that actually transfers that computed information to the next neuron. So this is the basic structure of a neuron, and this is how it works. So if you look inside our brain, there are 10,000 neurons. If you take 1 cubic millimeter area of volume of our brain, then it will be 10,000 neurons there. It's very dense, and they are very well connected. And all these connections and their interconnectivity and how they work as a team is still not found. We are still searching for that. So brain is still a mystic machine for most of the scientists. Most of the scientists are still looking into this. Let's go into the detail of how this particular neuron works. So I would go to the next slide. This is basically, like I told you, this is dendrite, soma, and axon. And if you look into the soma, so this is the computational unit. What happens is, let's go to our class 8 biology, class 9 biology. So inside soma and outside soma, there are few free ions, potassium and sodium ions, and they are usually sodium ions stay outside of the cell and potassium ions stay inside of the cell. Now, if something happens to you, or if you face some stimulus from your outside environment, like you see something, or if somebody touches you, or if you want to speak something, you feel an urge of appetite, something like that, then there is a stimulus that hits your neuron, corresponding neuron in your nervous system or brain. That particular stimulus actually opens up some ion channels. As you can see here, these purple and yellow channels. They open up those channels, and ions are getting exchanged between outside and inside of the soma. So once some information is coming, some stimulus is coming, or it is captured by a neuron via its dendrite, the information is taken to the soma. The ion channels inside the soma opens up on the membrane, and ion exchange happens via these ion channels and ion pumps. Then what happens is a membrane potential difference takes place between outside and inside. And that's when we call that particular neuron is excited. Now, once it is excited, the membrane potential tends to increase. As you can see from this graph, the neuron was in resting potential when nothing has happened. Then something happened. Then the membrane potential increases and it reaches to a peak action potential. We call it action potential. It is excited to a certain level, maybe plus 30 millivolt. And at that point of time, it sends that particular voltage spike via its action to the next neuron. So after it sends that spike, the voltage graph comes down. We call the membrane potential has been repolarized. And it is coming down so fast and so quick that it tends into the other direction so that it becomes hyperpolarized. So hyperpolarization is a state when that particular neuron will be completely inactive. It is unable to take any further stimulus from the outside environment. But this whole thing happens very fast, though I told it in maybe in 2-3 minutes, but it happens very fast. So if you have any questions, or if you want to interrupt me, you're free to interrupt. You can just unmute yourself and ask questions if you feel any question. So this particular time that you are seeing here, and it is fractions of second, I would say in the millisecond level or microsecond level. It depends on the nature of the neuron. So basically what we understood from here, it is basically the chemical reactions or chemical ion exchanges that makes this neuron excited based on some input stimulus that comes via dendrite. And then this particular neuron reaches to a membrane potential, we call it threshold potential, and then it sends a spike to the next neuron via its action. So the term that earlier speaker was talking about, that memory and computational co-location, how that happens. So you understood that computational part. So this is where the basic unit of computation is happening in this particular neuron. So this neuron is sending the information to the next neuron, and it is basically calculating based on its chemical equations or chemical things, that whether that information is good enough to send to the next neuron or not. And that is actually decided by that threshold voltage, right? So going to the next slide, if we want to take it to a reality, I mean, instead of biology, if I want to take it to a physics domain, if I want to create a circuit like that, maybe this is a very basic circuit, all of you know, a RC circuit, that very much closely resemble with that particular neuron functionality. So let us look into this, how it happens. The whole current, this current is a representation of the stimulus, you can tell. So this whole current is coming, it is going via a capacitor, and it is going via resistance, which are connected in parallel. So we call the respective currents as IC and IR. And as you see, the capacitance is basically the storing unit for charge, and resistance is basically the creates the resistance to the current, and it is trying to stop the current. So that is actually happening inside the neuron also, that I have shown earlier. This particular neuron, when the current comes in, it tries to accumulate its charges by exchanging these chemical ions, and at the same time it is deciding whether to send that particular current to the next level. So it is basically an RC circuit kind of functionality. So let's go into the basic math here. So we know that C is equal to Q by U, which is basic capacitance rule, and then we can write it like that. The rate of change of I can be rate of change of charge, and that is C du dt is equal to dq dt. That gives us, and then the derivative of charge is current, like I told you. So along with that, if you incorporate that Ohm's law, classic Ohm's law, V is equal to IR, then it gives you IR is equal to U by R. And that gives you, in these two terms, if we replace in the top equation, IT is equal to these two terms. So this gives me the basic RC circuit equation, where you can call this tau as a time constant. It means that what is the, this basically tells you the capacity of the circuit to discharge, how long it takes to discharge, and how long it takes to, accumulate the charge and all those stuff. So going next, in that particular chemical membrane potential case of neuron, where chemical ions takes a role, there you see that those potassium ions are passing through a particular channel, the sodium ions are passing through a particular channel, and there is some membrane part which is acting as a resistance. Nothing is passing through them, right? So this and also this gates, this ion channels and ion gates depends upon some other chemical components, and based on that it is decided how much they will open up, so that the amount of ion exchange is also variable. So this arrows in the K and Na is given as a arrow. It signifies that they are also variable. So the opening of these particular gates are also variable. And this membrane potential through which nothing can come in and come out represents the R. So this equation, if you take all the parameters and components into consideration, you reach to a very complex equation like this. This is what has been discovered by two scientists, Hodgkin and Huxley, around 1950, that this is the mathematical, or you can say electrical representation of how a neuron computes. Now, once we are in this particular form, we are good to code on it, right? We can write some code, maybe C code, Python code, or whatever. And then we can create a coded version of our neuron. And once we do that, we can tell that that particular module of code can act as a neuron, and we can replace it in our classical ANN. And that is exactly what we are doing in spiking neural network. So these kind of mathematical models or electrical models are being coded, and we are using that into our spiking neural network codes. So this is the very basic idea. There are many more complexity, which I am not going into details of that because of the time limitation. So this gives you a basic idea how these equations are coming and how these equations are used. Now, another mathematical approximation has been taken place. Like I was telling, when the neuron was in resting potential, as you can see, it is around -70 millivolt. Some excitation comes, and then it reaches to a threshold voltage, it gets excited or activated, and then at this particular point, it sends a spike or a voltage surge to the next neuron via its action, and then it repolarizes, right? In the phase, this number 2 says that it repolarizes, and it undershoots and goes to the hyperpolarized state. It happens in a fraction of 2 milliseconds, as you can see the scale here in the time axis. So it is not always 2 milliseconds, it is even less than that, based on, like I told, based on the nature of the neuron, based on the nature of the membranes and how they are built up and what is their functionality and all those steps. So this is very quick. So to approximate that into a mathematical domain, we usually keep that as represent that as a Dirac delta function, which gives us 0 or 1. We are not taking this whole continuous graph, which is there in the analog domain. We are taking it into a digital domain, making a spike here, maybe a spike here, and 0 otherwise. So if something happens at a particular time instant, which is tending to 0, we are reducing this particular time gap tending to 0, and we are saying that as it is tending to 0, there is an instantaneous voltage spike happens to the neuron membrane potential, and it sends that voltage to the next neuron, and that is what we call spike. And after that, it goes to the state 0. So this gives us the liberty to take it to the 1-0 domain, the digital domain. So that is why the Dirac delta function is used here. Now that gives me another disadvantage also, because we are in the 1-0 domain. Now it is discontinuous and it is not non-differentiable. So that is the problem that I will come later. I will discuss later. So the basic story of a neuron is this. Now, how the spike generates and how the neurons are connected and how they are affecting each other, that I will discuss here. Say you have two neurons here, which I call maybe the J is equal to 1 is written here, J is equal to 2 will be there. And there is another neuron which is receiving information from these two neurons. Now, what will happen to this ith neuron? That is our question. So what will happen to the membrane potential of this particular neuron? And why I am telling this? This will tell you how a network of the neuron actually works. So if you look at here, say at timestamp t, timestamp t1, some the ith neuron was at resting potential, and at the same time the jth neuron has fired. It is sending some data or sending some voltage to the to this particular ith neuron. We call the ith neuron as postsynaptic neuron. We call the jth neuron as the presynaptic neuron. So this pre and post will be very much in our later part of the discussion. So this voltage that is coming from J will increase the excitatory postsynaptic potential of I, correct? So that is what is happening here in that graph you see. Now, if I add one more neuron, J is equal to 2, and if that also sends a spike, that particular line, here on I will represent the voltage as spike. So that particular spike will join with J is equal to 1, and these two together will, maybe it has come at a timestamp 2, T2. Then if you see that effect of T1 is reducing on I, and at the same time, T2, the spike from J2 has come. And as a result, the membrane potential started to increase again. And by doing so, if I get continuous spikes from J is equal to 1 and J is equal to 2, the membrane potential of I will increase. And at one point of time, say after around this point, it will give a spike. So that is how presynaptic neurons are affecting the postsynaptic neuron. So you see that the computational stuff or the voltage thing that is happening all inside this kind of network. Now, one key part of this network is synapse. I am coming to that. So before I go to that, like I told in this equation here, that this is the classic Hodgkin-Huxley equation. This is okay to know, but this is not okay to work with. There are many different parameters, and it brings in many computational complexity when we'll put it in the field. That is why scientists across the world have worked in last 20-30 years, and they have come up with many different models of neurons, many different mathematical models. So the Hodgkin-Huxley is the most exhaustive one. Like I told, it is the most exhaustive biophysical model. Along with that, Professor Izhikevich has come up with another model called Izhikevich model around 2004, I think. That particular model is very much bioplausible at Hodgkin-Huxley, but it is at the same time, it is very much computationally efficient. And it also is able to mimic different behaviors of brain neurons, like the bursting, by the rating, and all those stuff that is happening in our brain. I'm not going to detail of that, but it is capable of mimicking those kind of behaviors that is very much common in our brain. Now, the last model, the third model that I have mentioned here is leaky integrate and fire model. This is the most widely used model so far in the spiking neural network domain. And this particular model is used, why it is used? Because it is computationally very efficient. It mimics most of the stuff that is happening in the spiking neural network or brain neural network. And at the same time, it models short-term memory through a leak mechanism. It has that added benefit here. And it also follows the attractor dynamics, which is basically the attractor dynamics is being the core part of brain being a chaotic system. So it always follows the attractor dynamics. So, so this particular equation that you see here is most widely used. Other than that, there are Maculo-Pitts model. There are other models of that have been created by scientists. So those we are not going to detail. These three are the most famous or most popular, I would say. But Hodgkin-Huxley is not used in practical spiking neural network networks applications. We mostly use Izhikevich or leaky integrate and fire model, which we call LEAF, popularly called is LEAF. And if you remove the leaky part, then it is called integrate and fire part only. That is also used. When I will go to the example, you will see that if neurons are also being used. Now, I was talking about the synapse. So far, I have told how the neurons are being modeled. The neuron, the soma, how the cell is being modeled, how it computes. That part is clear so far. Now, what happens when the axon is taking the voltage to the next neuron. Something is there inside, in between the axon of the presynaptic neuron and the dendrite of the postsynaptic neuron, and that we called is synapse. That synapse is basically the key location where the learning, or you will say memory, is being stored. And that is, let me explain how that happens. So there are different learning models like biological learning rules, approximate backpropagation, and ANN training based, which we do in classical ANN networks. Now, in case of spiking neural network, the first two are relevant, the bioplausible learning rules. So there are different variants of learning rules like Hebbian, Oja's rule. I will explain that, STDP, RSTDP, resume, etc. And they are basically based on the experimental outcome that neuroscientists have checked inside the neurons by putting electrodes inside our brain, or putting electrodes inside the neuron and axons. They have seen how the voltage difference is happening, how the synapse is behaving. So synapse is the key in these bioplausible learning rules. And along with that, there is one mathematical learning rules that we also use in spiking neural network, which is called approximate backpropagation. But that has some related problem. Like I had told you, if we approximate the spikes as a digital one, like ones and zero, then it brings in the using a Dirac delta function, then it brings in the non-differentiability part. So back propagation is a problem here. So classical back propagation is not possible. So that kind of learning is not possible. But recent works in around last 5-6 years, people have made different approximation with respect to back propagation and the neuron model, so that back propagation can be used. And the third kind of learning is you can train your classical artificial neural network, like using ConvNet and then ReLU and all those max pooling, using those kind of layers, and then convert that into a spiking neural network. And then you train it there in ANN domain, and then transfer those weights into the SNN domain and see how it works. So that is another thread of work and another thread of learning, you can say, that is happening. So let's go into the basic bioplausible learning rules. So like I told you, the presynaptic neuron is sending a voltage to the postsynaptic neuron, and that is being carried via the synapse. Earlier, people like, scientists like have found, with their limited apparatus and all, they found that if a particular neuron is firing at one corner of the brain, and say it is called another corner of brain, say B, then there must be some correlation between these two firing. I don't care how they are connected or not, or whether they are connected or not, but there is some correlation, and we call that there is some causal relation between A and B in terms of firing. And we call that rule as neurons which fire together work together. We establish that there is something is happening in between these two neurons, and we bind them together, and we establish a synapse between them, and we say that that particular synapse is learning something, so that next time A fires, there will be more chances that B will also fire, because that particular Hebbian learning, which has already established a connection between A and B during the first firing sequence, it has put on a weight on that synapse, and that particular synapse is helping, that particular weight is all tending it to fire next time when the same firing sequence happens. So if A fires, then B fires. One variant of that particular learning, though it was vague, but you cannot call it vague because it was at that point of time around 1970s or 60s, or tools or apparatus was like that. They could not think, or they could not prove beyond that. Now, Hebb's rule has been converted into another rule called covariance rule, where it has been said that Hebb's rule, what Hebb's rule said is, say, if A fires, then B will fire. So there is some connection, there is some learning is happening between A and B in the synapse, and that is the synaptic weight is increasing. Now it is on the positive side. Now, if A does not fire, then what happens? Then obviously B will not fire. And if it is going on for hours or days, then it means that A doesn't fire and B doesn't fire. And obviously that synaptic well should reduce, which explains the forgetting part. If I see you every day, I can remember your face at once because that particular synaptic weight will enhance that particular learning, that particular memorization. If A does not fire, then B will not fire. So I'll tend to forget you. So it's a very bad example, but still superficially, this is exactly what is happening. We call it the memorization part, we call it long-term potentiation, LTP. And the forgetting part we call is long-term depression, which is LTD. So covariance rule has been modified in order to accommodate that LTD because Hebb's rule only models LTP. And along with that, Oja's rule came next, which has been given on the right side of the screen. That he said that it is not only not linear, there is a v squared term on the equation. It is quadratic, and also there is a learning. I mean, a parameter alpha is also there, which actually can be tunable based on the stimulus and based on the synapse nature. So that's how the learning techniques or learning rules has been discovered and so far. Now, so far you have understood that firing of A and firing of B is very much related, and the related memory is being stored in the synapse. And that relates to the statement of the earlier speaker when he said that memory and computation are co-located. So it means that computation is being happened at the soma, and the memory is being stored in the synapse, and they are very much co-located, only an action away. And that action is of the same computing device called the neuron. So the soma and synapse are almost co-located, and that is actually the reason why it becomes so fast and it takes so less energy. That is the core reason, right? Now, if I go to the next slide, this explains another type of learning. What it says, so far Hebb's learning has said that if something is firing here and something is firing there, then you can bind them together and there is a causal relationship. But this particular spike time dependent plasticity that has came around in 2000 or so, the scientists have said that it is not only the firing together part, it is also when it is firing, before or after. What is the time difference between these two neurons of firing with respect to firing? If the pre-neuron fires before and the post-neuron fire next, and within a certain time limit, not maybe 1 day away or 1 hour after, not like that. Maybe within a certain logical time limit, if they fire together, then only there is potentiation. Otherwise, no. If T pre is firing maybe 2 minutes before T post, then we will not connect them. Similarly, if T pre fires after T post, then also that means that T pre doesn't have any effect on T post, right? Because it is firing after. So that way, the LTD or the forgetting part is also explained. So this is how the spike timing, the timing of the firing patterns is included. And that is actually the rule that we still follow today. There are different variants of STDP. In terms of anti-STDP, resume, there are different variants. I do not recall all the names, but that is actually what happens. So timing is very important and firing is very important, sequence of firing, and also the amount of firing, which we call the rate of firing. If given a excitation of 10 volt, maybe a neuron will fire 100 spikes. But given a excitation of 5 volts, the neuron will fire maybe 25 spikes. So the firing pattern is not linear. For 10 volt, maybe it is 100. For 5 volt, maybe it is 25. So it depends on the neuron how it will handle the input voltage and how it will give the output in terms of spike. So the spikes are not usually come in one single mode. Like one single spike you will never see. In practicality, once a neuron is excited, it gives a spike train, a long trains of 1 0 1 0 1 1 0 0, something like that, a long train of binary train of spikes. And you have to consider each of those ones as an excitatory input voltage to the next neuron in your network. And that is how we create the networks. Now, I will, so here the learning part is done, the memory computation co-location part is done, and now I will go to the simulation part, how we actually code all these things into the equation, into the code in Python or whatever. Before I go to that, there are different neuromorphic simulators for coding, for making it into the computational platform. This is one, there are proprietary platforms like Intel Loihi, Spinnaker, everything, IBM True North, different BrainChip, Akida, and all those things are there. Along with that, mostly universities across the world, they have the students and researcher groups there. They have come up with multiple freely available spiking neural network simulators, where you can actually code a spiking neural network and you can simulate the results giving some stimulus input. So Anarchy, PyNest, Pine, Nengo, all these are very popular simulators, and each of them has different purpose, and most of them are freely available, open source, and they support GPU, that is parallel computation. And most of them have a Python interface, and at the core they are written on C or C++. The last one that you see, the last row, BindsNet, that is what we particularly use in TCS for our work. So let's go to that, BindsNet. What and how BindsNet looks like. So BindsNet is basically a simulator that is built on PyTorch platform, deep learning platform, and it provides you it's basically class-based or object-based structure there. They create BindsNet networks.nodes where you can create the neuron models, like I told you, leaf models, if models, Hodgkin-Huxley model, your EGKBG model, those kind of nodes or computational units you can create there, or it has been already created by them. There are different topologies that they support, like the type of connection between these neurons, whether they will be feed forward, whether they'll be recurrent, whether they'll be probabilistic, those kind of things are supported. And the network objects is basically a network container object that is very much useful when you design the network. And there are monitors, which basically captures how the synapse and the neurons are behaving, what is their voltage outcome, what is their spike outcome, how they behave over time. And also very important is simulation time step. Simulation time step means when you are in your brain, inside your brain, there is no simulation, right? You get an excitation, you react, and there is something happening inside your brain, and some spikes are being generated, and brain reacts according to that. But here, when you are actually experimenting in your computer, you have to have some simulation time, so that if you give some input voltage to a particular set of neuron, I will take maybe 100 neurons in my input layer, 100 leaf neurons. Then if I say the simulation time step is being 1 millisecond, then it will create 1,000, very granular set of spike trends in 1 second. But if I take my simulation time step at 0.5 millisecond, 5 millisecond or 10 millisecond, then it will the spike trend will not be that granular, and obviously we'll miss some information in terms of spike. So basically, real information are getting transferred into the spike domain, and if I keep that DT very high, the spike intervals will be very low, and that way it will result into fast simulation, but the result will not be that accurate. So that is the importance of the time step. The installation wise, it is very easy. You can go to the BindsNet site. There is their GitHub site, which is this. Let me show you here. Okay. Is my screen visible now?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay, yeah. See, so this is the BindsNet GitHub site where there are many examples and all you can see. So I will first go through this particular example code, like how they are creating the neurons, creating a network. So this is basically they are creating a network to classify MNIST dataset. So this is how they are doing it. See, they are importing the network, the leaf nodes. They are trying to use leaf nodes. They are importing the connection, monitor, and this, and the plotting package. So they first create a network object. Then they create two layers. One layer is input layer that is consisting of n is equal to 100. Is it visible, by the way, at your end? Because of maybe I will.
Yes, sir. I can see.
Yeah, I think it is better now, right?
Right.
Increase the font. Yeah. So they are creating two layers. One is source layer, one is target layer. And the target layer is made out of leaf nodes. 1,000 such leaf nodes I am creating in that layer. Now I add these two layers to the network object here, network.add layer. I am giving them names A and B. Okay. Now what I do is I create connection between them. Now they are two isolated layers and I create a connection. What kind of connection? A forward connection. I create a connection object with from source layer to target layer with this much weight. This is my weight equation. This is how the weights will vary. I initialize them with some torch.random function, and then I add some variable, add some constant based on my requirement. And then I can also normalize them within a particular range if you want. And that normalization is actually being done there, 0.05 to 0.1. Within that particular range, the weights will be modified and will be initialized also. And then I add that connection to the network. Fine. Now, if I want to create some recurrent connection inside the output layer, then I can also do that. Similarly, I use a recurrent connection object. I create a recurrent connection object by the same syntax. And this particular recurrent connection, what is the purpose of this recurrent connection? It actually, if you compare with classical ANN, it is kind of RNN or LSTM kind of structure that gives you feedback to the same neuron. And that kind of neuron, that kind of connectivity is actually there inside our brain. Many neurons are looping back to themselves via other neurons. So that can also be mimicked here. So we add that connection also inside. I mean, this particular connection, if you see, the source layer is target layer and the target is target layer. So it is a self connection, recurrent connection, right? And we add a monitor. We have to monitor what is happening when we give a input to the network. So this is the monitor, and that has a state variable. So it's the S means it records spikes and voltages. Okay. And we add another monitor with respect to the second layer, target layer, which records spikes and voltages. We call it S and V, state variables. Here only spikes will be recorded. Here spikes and voltages both will be recorded, right? Now we add these two monitors to my network object, right? Then we give the input data. This is my input spike data. Here they are giving some sample data, random sample data like torch.Bernoulli. They are doing that function call. Instead of that, you can give a MNIST data set here that I will show you. So now you do the network run. And this particular time, this is your simulation time. This is your simulation time. And then once you run this, you get the spikes in the monitors. And if you plot them, it will look like this. So this is how the first layer has behaved over given that random Bernoulli distribution of simulation. And this is how the spikes of the output layer has behaved over a simulation time of 100 milliseconds. And this is how the voltage has been behaved. Now, this doesn't give you an idea of once we do the weight tracing, once we record the weights, there are mechanisms for that. This particular example doesn't cover that. Then that particular weight mechanism will tell you that whether the network has learned something or not. I am going to this particular example here. If you see, maybe here. So far, you see this particular network, again, another example. It takes a real input. So I create my input layer as a neuron of 784 layers. Obviously, this is for MNIST. I create an output layer of if nodes, not leaf nodes, as per my requirement, with n is equal to 10, because there are 10 digits in the MNIST. So my output layer will be 10 neurons, 1 hot encoding I will use there. And I add them to my network object, and then I name them X and Y. Then I create a connection between input and output, and I normalize them between -1 to 1, and add that connection to the object. And then I create the monitor also, and I create that simulation time here, 25, right? Simulation, number of simulation time steps per example. Per image, I will create 25 time steps. So I now load the MNIST dataset from my local, wherever it is, it may be in your cloud also. And then you run the training. This is how the training goes. For I is equal to image level, for all the images that are there in the MNIST dataset, you run the training loop here. And every time you run the network, the weights are getting updated, and you record that via the spike objects in this particular line, and retrieve the spikes and some inputs for both the layers, and then compute a softmax. And here, the learning here, they have used a gradient of loss and do SGD kind of update. Here you can incorporate your own learning rule. You can do a linear regression, you can do something else, and you can do STDP also. There is no example right now in my hands which incorporates STDP. But if you go inside BindsNet, there are STDP has already been implemented by them, and they can use directly here the network.learning rule as STDP. You can mention that. So this is basically how you encode, how you use a BindsNet, how you create a BindsNet network. Going back to my presentation, using these kind of networks, we have created, using this kind of simulators, we have created a convoluting spiking neural network of our own inside our research lab. And that has been used to recognize gestures from DVS dataset that Arijit has already shown you, the DVS outcome, that how the sensors looks like. And from there, we have tried to classify what kind of gesture a person is making in front of camera. Similarly, we have applied it on a radar, and in both the cases, we have actually get very high accuracy, 95% kind of, and the papers have been accepted in IJCNN. So these are the good works that we have done in the last 1 year or so with respect to a spiking neural network. And we found that the energy estimation for this kind of networks is much less compared to classical CNN or ANN prior art, whatever it is. They are using like, or just say blocks of Manhattan can be enlightened by them. I mean, GPU wise, this is also running on GPU for simulation purpose. And once it will run on a neuromorphic platform practically, like Intel Loihi or some other hardware, it will give you much further energy benefit. So we have computed an estimation. It is giving around, I mean, we are winning over 10 to the power 5 order in terms of joules. So that is what it is. I'll end up with another neural processor, that is Akida. This is a company created by a company called BrainChip based on USA, and they are our work partners in some way or the other. And they have created one very small neural processor called Akida. Why I am showing this is not a particularly simulator. This particular simulator is associated with a hardware platform called BrainChip. I mean, their chip's name is Akida BrainChip, and that is how the neuron fabric is made. It is an M+ CPU running on top of a crossbar kind of architecture that is there based on 80 NPUs, flexible Akida neuron fabric. They are created out of SRAM, all digital logic with SRAM. And we can modify that particular network as per our own need, but only the feed-forward network so far can be implemented on this kind of networks, this kind of chip, not recurrent. That is one limitation. And it can be connected to different sensors via JTAG, SPI, and all those memory interfaces and connectivity data input interfaces, PCI, and all those things, UART, JTAG. And obviously, they have a conversion engine inside their chip that helps. Actually, this particular figure gives you that. This is the whole framework of Akida. You can go to this particular link that I'm showing in the below corner of my slide, that https://doc.brainchipinc.com. There is detailed documentation on top of this particular architecture and how you can design that a network. The interesting part is that they have some models already in their Akida model zoo, like classical MNIST, CIFAR, all those VGGNet, everything is already been encoded into SNN and you can use that. That is one benefit. Another benefit is that you can create your own vanilla SNN network sitting on that particular platform. And at the same time, the third benefit is you can convert your CNN network into SNN using their APIs. They have a converter given to people. That converter will help you to run your CNN in SNN mode and see how it performs. So we are also doing something with respect to that. And this is there. They have also 3 flavors with respect to implementation. One is simulator, which we are using. Another is a FPGA flavor, and another is hardware flavor. They are claiming that their board will be priced around $10 or so, and it is going to be in the market in next few quarters. That is what they claim. If you want to install the Akida, it is also the few parts of Akida is free. At least the CNN to SNN converter is free, and some other parts are free. You can go into the documentation. You can run it on Ubuntu 18.20 anything, and it is Python based, TensorFlow version 2.4. Simple pip commands can help you install that. You better create a Conda environment, and you have also have to install some pip, do pip install some other components like Jupyter, Matplotlib, etc. Like I told, it supports feed-forward, fully connected, convolutional kind of connectivity and weight sharing, but only supports feed-forward, not recurrent. So a classical SNN network can be looking like for MNIST, maybe input data, then convolutional, then fully connected, then fully connected. That kind of network can be made on this particular Akida. So before I go to Akida example, let me show you one example that we have created. TCS and BrainChip together, we showed a demo in NeurIPS 2019. That particular demo was very well appreciated by the community there, and it was well publicized. So let me go to the demo without. So this is the kind of data that we are taking via DVS camera, and we are asking a robot to learn and behave according to my gesture. So I'm showing the camera 1 with my hand gesture, and the network has learned that this is class 1, and I'm training my robot to, if I show 1, you perform a task like moving forward or something. Yeah, the robot is moving forward with respect to this particular 1. This is your class 1. Now, like that, I am showing different other gestures like turn right, and then the robot is turning right, if you see. So this kind of learning, the key point is this kind of learning is happening very fast. This is online learning. It is taking the data from the DVS camera, and within 3 or 5 seconds, each of the class is being learned. And the robot is also learning how to behave. And then we have trained it almost 6 classes, 6 types of gestures. And then once the training is done, then we are showing it during testing time. We are just showing it, and the robot is behaving according to that. There is no more training. So it is the video time that you are seeing, the actual learning time was like that. There is no modification or manipulation inside that. So it is practically 3 to 5 seconds. Okay, so this we have showed using BrainChip's Akida platform in NeurIPS 2019, and a network in Akida. If you see that, I mean, one thing will be interesting for you. I thought that this CNN conversion for CNN, how you can convert a CNN. So basically, create this particular line set. You load your MNIST data, you reshape, the pre-processing part is there. Then you create your own model in CNN using Keras. So this is a convolutional 2D, Maxpool 2D. These kind of layers are there in your network. Say you design a network like that, and then you do a model compatibility check. That is also supported in Akida. You can do a model compatibility check using this particular API. Once the model is, you see that it is okay, you can convert that into Akida. Why I am saying this? Because these 4 reasons, that standard convolutional 2D and dense layers are supported, hidden layers must be followed by a ReLU layer. These are the restriction and in Akida. So batch normalization must always happen before activation, and convolutional blocks can optionally be followed by a max pooling. So this is the 4 checks that this particular API does. And then you train your model in your own on Keras using your MNIST dataset. And then you quantize your model. Why you quantize your model? Because that particular model, once it learns, it is of size huge, it cannot be ported into Akida chip because it has low memory. It cannot contain all that things together. So that is why you quantize it and discretize the version of the model, and weights and activations are quantized so as to be suitable for implementation on the Akida answer. That is the core purpose of quantization. And then once this quantization is done, you check whether the quantization is done properly or not, model quantize.summary. And then you run that, compile that with respect to Akida environment, and you run it. And then you can check your accuracy. It is observed that the accuracy is almost same at per, but energy advantage is huge. So that is a CNN to SNN example. With maybe last example is this one. How you create one vanilla SNN. You can create an input layer. You can mention the layer type. This is not CNN to SNN. This is a vanilla input. This is again for an MNIST. This your input width and input height is 28 × 28 to accommodate MNIST. And then you create a fully connected layer with flushing buffer. Number of neurons per class you assign 100. Number of classes you mentioned 10 because there is 10 classes in MNIST. And the packet size is 784, which means that one image at one go. If you create 784 into 2, then it would mean that 2 images at one go. Packet size will come like that. And threshold firing you can decide. Like I mentioned in the neuron equations, in leaf equations or that graphs, that there is a threshold in the neuron membrane potential. How, it will fire based on the threshold firing, threshold voltage. That membrane potential is usually kept at 60, but you can change it like 30 or 40 based on your requirement or to get more firing or something. And your weights will be like how many weight parameters you are going to give into the network. So, and how the learning will be. Akida unsupervised. There are these Akida unsupervised is inspired from STDP, but it is their core IP. So this is how a particular SNN, vanilla SNN can be designed, and this is how a CNN can be modified to a SNN. So with that, I would like to end my presentation. If you have any questions, you can mail me or you can ask me now, or maybe Arijita too.
The participants, if you can write your query in the chat box. You are also unmuted, so you can also unmute yourself and directly ask questions. If you have any query, you can unmute yourself and ask the question directly to sir. Or you may also write your query in the chat box. In case of any query, please write your query in the chat box, or else you can also unmute and say your query.
Somebody says he cannot unmute.
You can unmute participant because the permission has already been given. Please try once again. Permission has been given. So I request Swagata Roy, please unmute
Yes.
now.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. Sir, I have a question. You have shown 3 learning model So which one is more effective for event-based learning? You have shown there.
STDP, bioplausible, bioplausible. That is STDP or Hebbian rules. That kind of learning is good for event-based, because event-based is what our brain does. So obviously the corresponding or compatible learning technique should be what our brain does, right? So that is why STDP or will be good.
Okay, thank you, sir. And another, the simulator you have shown, that is free, that the student can use that.
Yes, yes. Some parts for Akida, some parts is free, not all. I mean, the CNN to SNN converter, I believe it is free. You can use that via API. And for BindsNet kind of simulators, and there are many other, Brian, BindsNet, and everything, that is also completely free. They are basically developed by students, PhD students, and universities, so they do not ask for money. So that is completely free.
Sir, where there is some tutorial that give you the
Yes, obviously. If
learning.
you, yeah. Let me go to the BindsNet. Am I still sharing my screen? Yes. So you can see my screen, right?
Yes.
So this is the BindsNet GitHub site. You can go there. There are, see, the docs are there, examples are there. This is the BindsNet core, where the actual code is there. You can modify it, which we often do in our lab. We create our own models, we create our own networks by modifying this particular code. We add new objects into that. You can, there is a testing part also, and there are some other README license, everything is there. So this is basically the source. And there, if you look at the documentation, this is the documentation link.
Okay. Sir,
Okay.
you have to Akira, that platform is not for recurrent, but this blind
This you
set.
can, yeah, right. BindsNet you can do recurrent.
Okay, sir, in case of recurrent network, is it possible to simulate using the temporal signal, not by the features values? So without extracting the features values, if we use it, can we use it to train from the temporal signal?
Okay, to answer your question, let me go back to my PPT here. This particular network that you see here, this is exactly your answer. Here we are taking a DVS dataset, we compress and encode, we throw away some of the data because that was huge size, we couldn't accommodate. Then we are taking a 128 cross 128 frame out of the DVS data. This is a gesture, right? It is happening over time axis. There is a time axis you can see. So each frame is changing over time. It means that there is it is basically a video, short video. So we are sending that particular frames to CSNN layer in this particular network, and each layer and each of these neurons are learning the special features of this frame. And once the special features is learned, this particular neurons is not learning anything else. Then the control goes to the next neuron in the next time step. Next frame comes, another set of neurons is learning the special information. By special information, I mean the special features that you are talking about. Once the special features are learned over different CSNN layers, we are feeding them into a recurrent network. This is basically, we are sending features, not the real data. So the features are feeding into the recurrent reservoir network. We call it reservoir because it is a probabilistically connected liquid state machine. This is basically a recurrent network, you can call. So this particular recurrent network is handling the features, and finally it is giving me a classification output. I mean, there is a classifier, of course, at the end. That is basically a one-hot classifier that you are using. So I hope this answers your question.
Sir, one more. That's me. Signal.
Hello.
Hello.
I couldn't hear you. Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah.
Sir,
now you're audible.
Okay, sir. If suppose I want to train my to recognize my voice, and we do not want to do any pre-processing, we want to just want to give the a small time span voice signal. So can we directly give to that time signal, that is amplitude or power variation with the time. So this is the
Right.
signal.
Yeah. So voice, like we were discussing this only yesterday also. Arpanda is here. He can also answer the question if you want. So basically, voice is basically very noisy signal. There are additional noise from the environment that is captured also. So usually, voice is not directly given to the network in whether it is ANN or SNN or anything. You have to transfer it to some other domain, like you have to do a
Fourier transform.
Fourier transform or something, and then you give it to the network. Directly, voice you cannot, speech data cannot be given. So.
Okay, thank you, sir. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So if there is any more questions, you can unmute yourself and ask the question to sir. For this session, if you have any query, you can go ahead, unmute yourself and ask the question. Participants, you can also write your query in the chat box. So if there's any more question, you can go ahead, unmute yourself and directly ask the question. Or else you can also post the query in the chat box. Okay, so with this, sir, we come to the end of this session. Thank you so much for your presence. I would like to thank both the speaker for this session. And since this is a virtual FDP this time, so for that, we would like to present a certificate here online as a token of appreciation. First, we would like to present it to Dr. Arijit Mukherjee. I would request Professor Tufan to kindly share the certificate, sir. I would request Tufan, am I audible? Thank you.
Yeah,
So,
thank you.
Yeah, so this time it is a virtual FDP. So this is a certificate, just a token of appreciation for your presence, sir. We would be mailing you the certificate, the same certificate in your mail. Next, we would like to present the certificate to Mr. Shaunak Dey. Thank you for your presence, sir. This is a certificate as a token of appreciation. Kindly accept this.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your presence. I would like to express our gratitude to both the speakers for their time and sharing their knowledge, exploring a completely new dimension to us, along with the implementations and different suggestions that you have given to us. Thank you so much. And with this, we come to the end of the second session of the day. I would also request the participants to please be careful about the attendance link, which would be shared right from 4:15 onwards and would remain active only until 5 o'clock. So with this, we come to the end of the second session and we would go for a very short break. We would come back again at 2:45, with which we would start our third session. Thank you, everybody.